Jordan is a remarkable and fascinating country to explore. Most people know of the ancient city of Petra, carved from the living desert rock, but there's so much more. From the beautiful classical ruins of Jerash to Byzantine church mosaics, all are accessed by the ancient route, the Transjordanian King's Highway. Running from southern Syria to the Red Sea and following the mountain ridge east of the Dead Sea Rift, the King's Highway connected to other major roads, including the route across Sinai to Heliopolis, modern-day Cairo. Travel with me along its mountainous route as we visit its ancient cities and hear the familiar stories that come direct to us from the pages of the Bible itself. Our route for this journey follows 800,000 pieces of stone marking our way, known as the Madaba map. It was rescued from the remains of a 6th century Byzantine church. This depiction of the Holy Land is the oldest surviving map of Palestine. It's not just impressive, it's instructive. It provides archaeologists with a wealth of valuable information about historical biblical sites. At its heart is Jerusalem, the focus for 6th century Christians. It's shown as a street map with its straight colonnaded cardo clearly visible. And along it are many important buildings whose features are still recognizable today. The best known is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But it's to Jerusalem's east that we gaze, the horizontal boundary of the Jordan, the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, the tributaries defining the hills of Moab and Edom. It is through these hills that the King's Highway twists and turns, passing through a wealth of historical sites. Here they look like little pictures with their biblical inscriptions. Among them are the site where John baptized, and the Cave of Lot. Both have been recently excavated and form part of our journey. That they exist on this map even before they were physically discovered on the ground shows how accurate the map is. From Madaba, our journey winds south along the eastern plateau of the Dead Sea Rift Valley, passing through the Iron Age capitals of Moab and Edom before we reach the wonders of Petra. Aqaba and Wadi Rum mark Jordan's southern limit. From there we journey to the land of the Nile. Finally, we'll retrace our steps through the Rift Valley of the biblical Exodus before rejoining the King's Highway to explore northern Jordan. Egeria, an early pilgrim of the late 4th century, travelled a part of this route. Retracing the footsteps of Moses, she crossed the Jordan River and wrote a lively account of her travels.
The priest of Livius advised us that if we were willing to undertake the labour, we could see the water which flows from the rock that Moses gave to the children of Israel. We very eagerly wished to go and turned at once out of our way.
The rock that Egeria came to see lies 7 kilometres northwest of Madaba. Here Moses is said to have struck the rock twice, rather than speaking to it as God instructed him. God tells Moses that he will die before entering Canaan because of his lack of trust. Moses was only allowed to climb Mount Nebo to see the distant land his people would inhabit.
This is Mount Nebo, and Mount Nebo very well known for the story of Moses when he actually led the Israelites from Egypt to the Holy Land. Here in Mount Nebo, God gave him the vision to see the Holy Land. He was not allowed to enter the Holy Land. And he died at the age of 420, and he was buried in the land of Moab.
And on her visit to Nebo, Egeria recounts,
We saw the place where the river Jordan runs into the Dead Sea, the city of Livius, and also Jericho. So great a height rose this lofty place where we stood, that the greatest part of Palestine could be seen with our eyes.
Today pilgrims still come as Egeria did to gaze out over the promised land, to survey the ground that God gave to the tribes of Israel. but few realize that Nebo was the worship center to another god, the Moabite god Chemosh. 3,000 years ago, this plateau was inhabited by tribes who fought for its control. Their struggles form the backdrop to many Old Testament stories.
David coveted a beautiful lady whose name was Bathsheba. Bathsheba, however, was married, and she was married to a man called Uriah. And David at that time was expanding the kingdom of Israel across the river Jordan into the territory of the Ammonites and the Moabites. And he laid siege to the capital of the Ammonites, Rabbath Ammon. So he devised a plan whereby he requested that General Joab put Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, in the forefront of the siege of Ammon, where he hoped, of course, that Uriah would meet his end, and Bathsheba went on to become the mother of King Solomon. One of the main reasons that David wanted control of that area is that along the limestone plateau is one of the oldest and most important trade and communications routes of antiquity in that region, the so-called King's Highway.
According to the biblical book of Numbers, this land once belonged to the Moabites until the Amorites gained control, only to lose it later to the Israelite tribe of Reuben. Control of this region seesawed back and forth until Omri, son of Israel, made it a tributary state for some 30 to 40 years. Discrepancies between the archaeological evidence and the biblical accounts still exist, but the discovery of a black basalt stela at Dibon confirms the biblical description of King Mesha's revolt against Israel from a different perspective.
Moab was clearly famous for its sheep, because the Bible tells us that King Mesha of Moab had to pay 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams in tribute to the Israelites. And so I think it's not surprising that round about 853 BC, which was when the then king of Israel, Ahab, died, there was a weakening of the Israelite monarchy, and Mesha decided the time had come to rebel.
According to the Moabite stela, the revolt started when Chemosh commanded Mesha to
"Go, take Nebo against Israel. And I went by night, and fought against it from break of dawn until noon."
Killing all the inhabitants, Mesha made a sacrifice of the city and brought the altar hearths of Yahweh before his God. Uniting Moab's chiefs, Mesha fought off Israel's counterattacks and built his new city using prisoners of war.
And he goes on to tell us about how he rebuilt the defences of his capital, Dibon, and how he built a palace there, and he also established a temple for the god, the name of whom was Chemosh.
I built Jericho, the wall of the parkland and the wall of the Acropolis. I built its gates and towers, and I built the king's house. And I dug the ditches for Jericho with prisoners of Israel.
Dibon occupied two natural elevations. The higher northern hill was the new city, while the lower southern hill was the residential area. Today, the southern hill is still occupied by the modern town.
In the Roman period, it was apparently a dangerous area, roaming bandits all over the place. And in order to guard the successor to the King's Highway, Trajan's New Road, the Via Nova Traiana, the Romans built two forts, one low-lying on the south bank and another one right at the top, also on the south bank of the valley.
In many of the villages along the plateau live formerly nomadic Bedouin, still producing traditional rugs on ground looms made of sticks and other portable objects. The work appears simple enough until you see the detail involved. Pushing and pulling, beating and plucking to create the thick, dense cloth that withstands the severe wear of nomadic life. And it's all done while keeping a watchful eye on their flock of sheep and goats. the spinning looks a little easier, turning the spindle quickly in her open right palm while feeding the strands of fleece with her left. This same spinning and weaving process has been used for centuries, creating the traditional designs of the tribe. The growing pains of Moab continued, for Israel again mobilized her troops and set out from her heartland, enlisting the support of Judah and Edom.
We do know that Edom did tend to ally with its neighbours across the Wadi Araba against Moab and Ammon, which were of course its competitors for control over the Transjordanian lands and over the Transjordanian trade routes.
They had camped on Edom's northern boundary, the Wadi Hassa, but were now suffering from the dry, arid conditions and the lack of water. The Bible tells how the three kings sought the guidance of an oracle of Yahweh named Elisha, a prophet who had accompanied the army on its long march. Elisha received a message from God which would help the army. Dig ditches which the Lord would fill with water.
You will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water.
By the following morning, water flowing from Edom had filled the ditches, revitalizing the Israelites and their allies.
The word Edom means red, and it's to do with the fact that when you come down to the southern part of the upper plateau, of the upper tablelands, you get the underlying sandstones cropping out from the overlying limestone rocks.
Mesha's opposing forces were posted on the northern slopes. To the Moabites, the water looked like red blood, and so, thinking that the three kings had fought and slaughtered each other, the Moabites rushed across the wadi to profit from Israel's misfortune.
But when the Moabites came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and fought until they fled.
The Bible tells of how the Israelite coalition pursued the Moabites, destroying many towns. But Mesha's forces finally rallied at Kir Hareseth, where the coalition laid siege. Descending down the Wadi Karak, with the modern town and Crusader castle dominating the skyline, it's easy to see how the Israelite slingshot troops posted on these overlooking heights inflicted serious losses on the garrison at Kir Hareseth. Mesha tried to lead 700 swordsmen and cut his way through the Edomite ranks, but he was repelled, and in despair he sacrificed his elder son to Chemosh.
The fury against Israel was so great, they withdrew and returned to their own land.
Moab's hard-fought independence was not to last, for Assyrian inscriptions record the Moabite king Salamanu as a giver of tribute. By 732 BC, Moab, along with Ammon, Judah and Edom, had surrendered to Assyria.
Initially, the earlier Mesopotamian empires, from the time of the first of the Sargon of Akkad in the 2300s BC, they used to bring their armies on campaign and regularly take back home with them vast quantities of tribute and slaves. It was only really with the Assyrians that you started to get proper empire building. And as they moved westwards, they stayed. And they then did establish provincial capitals with provincial governors and provincial administration.
The earliest archaeological evidence of Edomite settlement coincides with the Assyrians' western campaigns of the late 8th century BC. Edom was no doubt an important source of copper for the Assyrians. The labour force exchanged its nomadic lifestyle for simple farming around the mining centres. Busera is one of a dozen Iron Age sites attributed to the Edomites and is thought to be their capital city. Originally covering a substantial area, including parts of the modern village, Busera was built on an easily defended promontory and overlooking a deep, rich, arable valley. One possible resident of the Busera region may have been Jobab, a rich ruler of the land of Uz, who used to take possession of fields which belonged to orphans. He even used force, but then after ploughing them ready for sowing, he would return them to their rightful owners. In a passage from the Old Testament, Jobab falls victim to a heavenly competition. Refusing to curse God for his misfortune, Jobab is drawn into an argument with 4 other characters about divine justice. In a farewell address to his children, Jobab reviews his life, telling them he's of the generation of Abraham and that, like Abraham, he'd changed from idolatry to the worship of the true God, who changed his name to Job because of his piety. While Busera continued to be inhabited until the early 3rd century, evidence from nearly every excavated site shows a clear gap between Edomite and the later Nabataean settlements. It seems that once the Assyrian Empire began to decline, the Edomite state disappeared. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander the Great began his Macedonian campaign against Darius, eventually leading to the collapse of the Persian Empire and the dawning of a new age. It's also around this time that we gain our earliest accounts of another people, the Nabataeans. No one knows which part of Arabia they came out of, but they spoke and wrote in Aramaic, the language of Christ.
The Nabataeans, who are first mentioned by a classical historian, Diodorus Siculus. And when Diodorus first talks about the Nabataeans, they are a nomadic people who were cunning and very able to store up water for their flocks in the desert. And it seems as though, even when they were still nomadic, that they were involved in trade. He mentions the trade in aromatics from South Arabia, which was to become so much the basis of the economy of the later settled Nabataeans.
In dating this account to the turn of the 3rd century BC, we begin to see the Nabataeans as nomadic people, starting to police their trade routes and levying tolls. Slowly but surely, by 200 BC, they had adopted the life of settled people in and around what became their capital city, Petra. Covering an area of 25 square miles, Petra is an enormous site with many suburbs. The Sikh is an impressive 1.2 kilometre long entrance forming the main ceremonial way. Paved throughout its length and chased with water channels and decorative niches, most of the journey is conducted in shadow. It's this darkness that heightens your expectations. Moving closer, nature's carved sandstone curtains are slowly drawn back to reveal the most impressive sight, the treasury.
It was obvious that as a visitor to Petra, they wanted you to see that when you got to the end of the gorge. They'd already carved quite a lot for you in the gorge, including a spectacular relief of a camel train. Very much worn now, but in antiquity must have looked spectacular.
At almost 40 metres high, it is the best preserved monument in Petra due to its protected location from the wind and rain. Carved out of the living rock, its facade expresses the eclectic nature of Nabataean culture, encompassing a blend of Eastern and Western beliefs. The upper section of the treasury is dominated by the tholos, a central circular structure surmounted by a huge urn. The Bedouin believed this urn to be the vessel in which the great black magician's treasures had been placed for safekeeping during his pursuit of Moses. Framed within the broken pediment, this urn was watched over by 4 great eagles, perched on each of the pediment's 4 corners. Now their headless bodies are the only remaining visible evidence of their presence. But these great birds were not the only sentinels employed on the facade.
If you look between the first and the second upper column, the fifth and the sixth upper column, you're going to see the Amazon fighters. The Amazon fighters are Greek, in Greek mythology. They are dancing not for entertainment, because they are dancing for the war dance, and they are holding the axe in their hand, and they are protecting a god. It's not a male god, it's a female god, and that's the one between the third and the fourth upper column, the Egyptian goddess Isis. But if you look deep in, you will see what we call victory goddess, Nikki or Nike. Usually you will relate Nikki or Nike with the Taiki of the place. Here it could be that's Isis, the Taiki of Petra. Going down between the first and the second column, the fifth and the sixth column, you'll see a horse and a man next to it. The one on the left in charge of the west, the one on the right in charge of the east. They are sons of Zeus. We call them the riders.
Isis and Castor and Pollux were somehow seemingly associated with a safe passage of the soul of the dead across to the netherworld, which would be very appropriate on a facade of what was clearly an important tomb.
Those capitals, they look like Corinthian. They are not Corinthian, because the Corinthian capitals will have only the acanthus leaf. Here you have the acanthus leaf and what look like heads or grapes. Those more likely a combination, and more likely they are from Alexandria in Egypt.
We owe a lot to Alexander, one of the greatest generals the world has ever known, bringing with him his European culture, where he met the East. And he brought ideas. He also brought the language, Greek. It's a very exciting period in Egypt too, because their Greek culture has met ancient Egyptian culture. And it's this wonderful amalgam of literature, traditions, religion, and architectural styles that finds its echo in Petra.
The theatre is another example of the Nabataeans' adoption of these Hellenic ideas. Archaeologists have revealed evidence that this building belongs to the early 1st century, illustrating Petra's cosmopolitan nature under the reign of King Aritas IV. Many of the most notable buildings of Petra were constructed during his reign.
One of the main sources for Petra and the Nabataeans is the Greek geographer Strabo. He talks about Petra, he tells us about the king and being Demotikos. He talks about the king holding great drinking parties, symposia as they're called, in his great house. A great house was the Semitic way of describing a palace. And he says that they pass the cup around and they drink one after the other, and they're entertained by singing girls. So it all must have been rather nice. And he mentions the gardens. He says that Petra was a garden city. Looks very desolate today. There was plenty of water for the gardens. They lived in great villas, and slowly but surely the villas are being excavated at Petra, because behind the main public buildings on either side of the main street were the villas of the wealthy Petrans, and a number of them have already been excavated, and they've produced some beautiful paintings on the walls. There seem to be two main styles in Nabataean painting, all brightly coloured. Either quite simple geometric decoration, or that lovely decoration of foliage, entwined vines and grapes, with little cherubs or putti playing instruments among them, and birds, different birds in the trees. Very pretty indeed, and I'm sure that as excavations continue, more and more of this lovely painting is going to come out of the villas.
From Petra, the King's Highway descends gradually and joins forces with the Desert Highway, running past Wadi Rum and its otherworldly natural wonders, like something from the planet Mars, before eventually reaching the port of Aqaba. Here, the modern traveller has to negotiate the diplomatic obstacles of border crossings before entering Egypt. The ancient traveller simply turned west and entered the Sinai. The Bible recounts the patriarchs' journeys along this desert route, seeking refuge in times of famine.
In the Hebrew Bible, my country or this country is mentioned as Misr or Mizraim or Mitzrayim. That word M-I-S-R is the word in the Quran, the Muslim book, and it's the same word in the Hebrew Bible. So that's the word we all know. And Mizraim, if we refer to Jacob, Israel, talking to his children and telling them that this is your Mitzrayim, this is your Mizraim, this is your sanctuary or your shelter land. So the word that meant shelter land or it meant sanctuary. Ancient Egyptians referred to their land as black fertile soil around the great river of Egypt. The rest of that land is desert, and that was called Deshret, and Deshret meant red land. Black land was called in hieroglyphics Kemet, E-Kemet, E-Kop, E-Keptos, Egyptos, Egypt. So word Egypt that we know today in English originally came from an ancient Egyptian word that meant black land around the river Nile.
Running through a narrow valley south of modern Cairo and fanning out into a wide alluvial plain, the river still forms the core of Egypt today. This prolific garden essentially forms a long oasis through the desert. Wherever its waters reached, the soil can be farmed. As these 4,500-year-old hieroglyphics attest, the river's cycle provided everything needed. Egyptian linen, grain and flax were exchanged for wood, wine and spices. But the ancient Egyptians also sought another commodity: slaves.
We know from Genesis that Joseph came to the land of Egypt, and he probably came here very young. He couldn't have been 20. He must have been around 13, 15, 16 years old max as a young man. But also Bible did not tell us where exactly was Joseph. We know he married a girl from today's Cairo airport district, Heliopolis. So we surely know that the Bible says that Joseph married a daughter of the high priest of On or Heliopolis. So he married a girl from this district, from the surrounding.
Cairo lay at the geographic and religious heart of Egypt. It was the ancient center of the sun cult, claiming to be the original site of creation.
Bible referred to this town as On, and it meant Sun City. Sun City by the Greeks is Heliopolis. So when Genesis spoke about Joseph married a girl who was a daughter of the high priest of Heliopolis, that meant Cairo.
430 years later, the Israelite tribes departed, taking Joseph's remains with them. Our journey takes us back along that route, through the Rift Valley of the biblical Exodus and the cities of the Dead Sea Plain. Finally, we rejoin the King's Highway and explore northern Jordan. Starting from Aqaba on the northern tip of the Red Sea, the rift is one of the most striking geographical and geological features of Jordan, running right up to and including the Sea of Galilee. It forms part of the northern reaches of the Great African Rift, which starts several thousand kilometers away in East Africa and extends through Jordan. The rift itself is a result of the African Sinai Plate and the Arabian Plate constantly moving apart, making the area very unstable. There are major earthquakes every 100 years or so. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah can be explained by one of them. Today it seems a very inhospitable climate, but historically, was it any different?
It was much greener than it is today because the Edomites, and following them the Nabataeans, were among the best hydrologists of antiquity, and the way in which they harnessed the water runoff was extraordinary. First of all, they would use natural springs. They also created cisterns which were carved deeply back into the rock. If you've created some kind of system to channel much of that water that's pouring off the mountainside into runnels, which then take it into such a cistern, you have harvested a lot of water. So one must imagine that in many periods of antiquity, there were actually fields on the slopes where we now see dry, hot and dusty sand and rocks.
As we near the southeastern coast of the Dead Sea, the land drops down suddenly. This is the Southern Gore, a place known in the Bible as the Valley of Salt. Here sprawled the fertile plains of the 5 cities of the book of Genesis, where Abraham and Lot parted company, and also the possible location of the doomed cities of Sodom and Gomorrah.
The fertility of the land, I think, is expressed very well by the story of Abraham and Lot, a story which takes place probably around 1900 BC, when the tribe of Abraham was getting too big for the amount of grazing land which was available for the flocks. So the idea was mooted of splitting the group up, and they're down in the southern reaches of the Dead Sea. It's obviously very fertile land, and Abraham, who remember is the oldest, asked his nephew Lot, which area do you want to take? And Lot sees this nice green land in the south of the Dead Sea. He said, I'll have that. The Lot takes the area of the cities of the plain, 2 most famous of which are, of course, Sodom and Gomorrah.
We are in Bab al-Dira, what's believed to be Sodom. In this area, it's actually a very large site. We have found foundation of the houses, we have found the walls, and we have found the tombs. In here we found a layer of ash, indicate that the city was set on fire. And of course the date goes back to 2350 BC. It is actually before Abraham, before Lot. That's why archaeologists are still digging to look a city, a Bronze Age city, which goes into the time of Abraham, which is around 2055 BC to 1900 BC. Until now, they have not found any.
Recent excavations have revealed the stone foundations of a massive mud brick town wall, which was as much as 7 meters thick. There are several gateways and towers, and a sanctuary which includes what archaeologists say is an altar.
Lot is not to know at that time that in the eyes of Yahweh, the peoples of the cities of the plain had been certainly overdoing things. They were great sinners, and a great catastrophe was about to overcome them.
According to the biblical text, Lot settles down with his wife and daughters, but is warned of the pending catastrophe. As they are leaving, Lot's wife did the wrong thing, looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. Then Lot, with his daughters, finds shelter in a cave in the mountains.
The daughters get very worried about perpetuating the race because they can't see any more human beings left on earth. And the only man around is their dad, Lot. So they devise a plan. They get their father drunk, and during his drunkenness, he has intercourse with each of his daughters. Each of his daughters become pregnant, and in that way, the Bible explains the origin of the Ammonites, who are descended from Ben-Ami, the son of one of Lot's daughters, and the Moabites, descended from the other daughter. As for the cave, where Lot and his daughters are said to have taken shelter, that was clearly a holy site from very early on. Found a church and the cave, and attached buildings, no doubt, belonging to a monastery of the Byzantine period. Church, of course, called the Church of Lot's Cave, and excavations inside the cave itself in the mountains have revealed Byzantine tombs and also earlier tombs, for that whole area was also inhabited, interestingly, in the Bronze Age, particularly in the Middle Bronze Age, which takes us to the, let's say, the 2nd millennium BC.
From Lot's cave, there's a spectacular view. Lush green set against brown and blue. The reflective pools of the Dead Sea's southern basin shimmer in the heat. From these evaporation pools, the precious minerals of the Dead Sea are taken. Now artificially created, these pools are maintained by pumping water from the deeper northern basin into the shallower southern basin. The northern basin is still a natural inland lake, but the waters are evaporating at a much greater rate than they're being replenished. Its main water sources, the River Jordan and the great Wadi streams which cut down from the limestone uplands to the east, are being used increasingly for agriculture and domestic purposes. One of the features of the Dead Sea is its climate. Its dense atmosphere filters out a lot of ultraviolet radiation, making it very good for those with skin problems.
The Dead Sea has 30% salt, which makes it about 10 times the salt in any other ocean. That salt and also the muds of the Dead Sea are therapeutic. And the properties of the Dead Sea waters have been known for a long, long time. Herod the Great, for example, suffered from some appalling disease, which is described in detail by Josephus, but he knew of the properties of the Dead Sea. Herod had a baths complex built at a place called Pelerinaj, which had the benefit of being practically by the shores of the Dead Sea, and also was alongside one of the many hot springs which are a feature of the Eastern Mountains, which along with the Dead Sea are also very much enjoyed by local people today.
5 miles north of the Dead Sea and close to the Jordan River lies Sfinte, the place of the willows. This is the lowest point on planet Earth, well below sea level. 9 miles to our west is Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world.
These are important landmarks actually, because if we follow what we have in the Old Testament, Joshua led the 12 tribes of Israel from here to Jericho. And then 2 Kings chapter 2 tell us how Elijah and Elisha come from Jericho. When Elijah's mantle touches the Jordan, it splits and he moves eastward and ascends to the heavens in a chariot and horse of fire. It's ever so interesting to know that the very last words in the Old Testament say that Elijah will come back. And that's important because there's a link between the Old and New Testament. Luke chapter 1 verse 17 is an example which tells us that John came in the spirit and strength of Elijah. So he came to the place from where Elijah ascended to heaven and started his ministry here. We've discovered a monastery on Elijah's Hill. Now, this monastery is important for 4 major reasons. Number 1, it's built in the place where Elijah ascended to the heaven. Number 2, it is the first monastery east of the Jordan on the early Christian pilgrimage route extending between Jerusalem and Bethlehem to the west and Mount Nebo to the east. Now, the third importance is that it includes a cave in the western side where many pilgrims and historians say that John dwelt in this cave.
Using the dwelling place of John as the apse, this natural cave formed an integral part of a 5th century church, with the nave and 2 aisles projecting back from it. The finely worked sandstone column bases still define the church's former outline. With so many pilgrim travellers testifying to Elijah's Hill, the church and its unique apse, identification of the site was easily established.
That became a very important source for us to know this is the authentic site where important biblical events took place. The fourth thing is St. Willibald from Britain. He stayed actually here overnight in the middle 8th century, saying that 6 monks live in it. Then the next morning he went on a mile to the west, describing the place where Jesus baptized, the church remaining there. What's interesting about having the monastery being used in the 8th century is that we're into Islamic period. Now that's an example of coexistence that we enjoy in Jordan.
But would John have approved of such a coexistence?
John the Dipper was a great leveller. All classes and conditions were invited to come and be dipped. You didn't have to be respectable. You could be one of the riffraff. He had tax collectors there who were the quislings, traitors to the Jewish people. There were prostitutes, there were terrorists who went around stabbing people in the back. There were Roman soldiers and the odd Pharisee.
Evidence that the site has been used for baptisms from as early as the 3rd century lie on the tell itself. Down the inner staircase, pilgrims would descend into the pools to be baptized. Fed by a deep cistern and settling pools, this sanctuary attracted pilgrims well into the medieval period.
It was a social gospel, really. He was very insistent that those who had an excess of wealth, the better off, shared what they had with those who didn't have very much. He told the tax collectors not to be rapacious, not to take too much. He told the Roman soldiers not to bully people. He lived a very, very simple life himself, living out in the desert. He wore only a camel skin. He ate things that he could pick up in the desert. Probably the most enthusiastic of John's disciples would have copied his habits and would have worn the same clothes. You've got to imagine people who looked a little bit like the Flintstones going around the place. You know, people would say, well, here come the Baptists, and you could see them coming all in their camel hairs.
If John's life was unusual, then his death was unforgettable. As we rejoin the King's Highway, this road leads us to a desolate place. Now, back on the plateau overlooking the Dead Sea, is Mishnaka. Mishnaka, its ominous Arabic name means gallows, but in Gospel times it was known as Machaerus. According to the 1st century historian Josephus, it was here that John was imprisoned and eventually beheaded.
Herod displayed, I think, the influence of John's teaching when there was a famine, and Herod shared his wealth with the people who were suffering at the time. But John did go too far, in Herod's opinion, when he criticized the fact that he had married his brother's wife. Her name was Herodias.
Josephus tells us of how Herodias agreed to become Herod Antipas's wife, on condition that he should divorce King Aritas' daughter. Antipas agreed, sending his wife here to Machaerus. Located close to the Nabataean border, built on former Nabataean land, Machaerus was one of a number of forts established to protect the territory won during the Maccabean revolt. Having been appointed by Rome to succeed the Hasmonean dynasty, Herod the Great redeveloped the site into a fortified palace. The rectangular Acropolis was divided into 2 wings. The eastern wing contained the armory and a spacious bathhouse. The western wing, a cistern, surrounded by a large colonnaded courtyard with 2 triclinia halls opening onto it. From here, preparations for King Aritas' daughter's return to Petra took place. It was organised by her father's generals.
So Aritas made this the first occasion of his enmity between him and Herod, who also had some quarrel with him about their boundary. So they raised armies, prepared for war, and sent their generals to fight instead of themselves.
The circumstances behind John the Baptist's death are bizarre. Herod held a birthday party in which Herodias' daughter, Herod's stepdaughter, was invited to dance, and probably in a state of intoxication. Herod was so pleased with her dancing that he offered her half the kingdom, whatever she required. And on the advice of her mother, Salome, her name was to ask for the head of John the Baptist. And we're told that Herod didn't like this, but he was in a public place and felt bound by his oath.
Is Machaerus the location for the birthday celebrations? Was it here that Salome danced? Scholars are divided, even as to whether it took place at all. But Josephus conveys the belief that Herod's army was destroyed due to an act of punishment from God. divine retribution for killing a good man.
When the Romans took over the kingdom of Nabataeans in 106 AD under the great emperor Trajan, one of the first things that Trajan did was to repair, remodel, and in some places use a slightly different route to the King's Highway, because that for him was a very important north-south route for trade, for communications, but also for the passage of his armies.
The green of biblical Gilead greets us as we start the final leg of our journey. Traversing a succession of wadis and hills before ending in southern Syria, the King's Highway passes through a region known as the Decapolis, a collection of cosmopolitan cities that had, by the 3rd century, grown to become the grandest in the Greco-Roman East. One of the most beautiful and best preserved of these cities is Jerash.
First ruins as settlement in the area of Jerash goes back to 10th century, 9th century BC. At that time, Jerash was called Jarsho. Jarsho was a small farming settlement, and Jerash, even by the Greek time, it was still a small settlement, not very much different than Jarshon. It was like this until 106 AD. We have some evidence that Trajan built the Cardo. 129 AD, we think that's the era when Jerash was populated. That's because of Hadrian, the emperor. He actually was traveling in the area and he came through Jerash. Of course, when the emperor travels, he actually have soldiers, different people coming from different area, looking for a new start, for a new region. So we assume that's the time when Jerash was populated. And that's why most of the ruins in Jerash goes back 2nd century AD onward.
Hadrian's presence had stimulated the city's wealthy landowners to provide the best civic amenities possible, building monumental gates, splendid temples, a hippodrome and theatres.
You have to imagine the wealthy families each vying with each other as to who could provide the best service for the city, because it was really a matter of prestige. And because you had the wealthy families competing with each other for whatever they were sponsoring, be it something that we see today, a building, or more often than not, a festival. If you were one of the sponsors or the benefactors, then you made sure everybody knew about it. Your statue was placed somewhere in the city. And these cities, which today are so devoid of statuary, would have been the opposite in antiquity. Not only would everything have been plastered and coloured and oh so garish to our mind, but in addition there would have been statues everywhere of anybody who was anybody.
A quintessential feature of a Greek city long before Alexander's time had been the theatre, where plays and other entertainment was staged. All the Decapolis cities had at least one, together with a smaller Odeon. Yet despite the Decapolis cities having Greek origins, all these theatres were constructed in the Roman period.
They didn't have weekends, remember. They had festival days, holidays, holy days. And festivals could last for weeks on end, particularly in the agricultural off-season. And that's the time when the rich people are spending their money on the city. And very important, the populace who is benefiting from the money spent by the great landowners then considers itself beholden to them.
In a Roman theatre, usually you will have similar construction where you have the main entrances, you have the orchestra area, the seats, the stage, and the stage wall. Now, usually the stage wall would be as high as the last seat, and behind the stage wall you'll find the changing room.
Remember, they all spoke Greek in the cities, so they have access to Greek comedy, Greek tragedy, with all that entailed. The narrator telling you what's going on, the chorus echoing what's happening. Much of the action happening backstage, because that was a tradition there. People would pop out. You never see any murders on stage.
Now, the ordinary population loved these plays, although in fact the Pharisees didn't like them. Now, in the theatre, the play actors, they wore masks to conceal their identity. And it's interesting that Jesus picked up on that, and he called the Pharisees hypocrites, which actually means mask wearers.
Further north at Gadara, the theatre displays another social structure attacked by the teachings of Jesus. Unlike the theatres of the Greek polis that had open seating for most citizens, in the Roman theatres the best seats were reserved. Located close to the orchestra, they had backrests and were inscribed with the leading families' names. There were different entrances for the elite and for the common people, the vomitoria. In this way, the theatre visibly demonstrated the social hierarchy and class distinctions frequently attacked in the Gospels.
Looking at the geography of a site and also the geography of the stories associated with the site is always quite fascinating. The view from Gadara across the great gorge of the River Yarmouk to the Golan Heights and Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee beyond, is quite spectacular. Spectacular geographically, looking at the border of Jordan, the Sea of Galilee, which is in Israel, and the Golan Heights, Syrian-occupied territory. And also the story of the Gadarene swine.
The frequent crossings to the other side in the Gospels suggest that Jesus came into the Decapolis region, but the tradition restricts his visits to the countryside. The most notable is the story of the demonic possession by Legion. Our final destination is Pella, another of the Decapolis cities lying on the lower slopes of the Rift Valley, where Eusebius tells us that some of the early church fled in order to escape the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The growth of Christianity was well established in Pella by the 2nd century, aided by the writing of Matthew's Gospel, which may have been composed here. Its publication by the way of public recitals in the small Odeon serves to highlight that these Gospels were not just designed to be read as individual stories, but as a complete narrative aimed at a wide audience. Constantine's endorsement of the Christian religion in 313 heralded a period of prolific church building in Jordan, which is reflected here in the cathedral church.
So the first church was the smallest of them all. It was just a 3-aisled rectangular building. Then they added a forecourt or an atrium. And the original 3-aisle church was then extended out by putting 3 apses at the end of each aisle. The decoration of the church must have been rather lovely. They had some opus sectile in the courtyard. And they also found the remains of some glass mosaic when they were excavating the church. The forecourt was subsequently extended outwards, and an archway was put at the end of the atrium of the forecourt, with finally a stairway coming up from the valley bottom over the original baths house. So you'd have come up there under a rather nice archway into the atrium or forecourt, and then beyond that into the church proper.
Sadly, little remains of the floor and wall mosaics that would have decorated the interior of the church. But Jordan does enjoy many fine examples rescued from the remains of the Byzantine churches built well into the 8th century. Early examples depict fish and lambs, which were associated with Christ, but other symbols too frequently recur in the later periods. Peacocks symbolize the immortal soul, the lion and the bull symbolizing paradise, sheep tied to a tree for sacrifice. Many depict everyday life scenes, wildlife and foliage designs. Made at a time when the majority of the population was illiterate, these mosaics served as visual explanations of biblical teachings. Painstakingly reproduced for tourists, they are the jewels of Jordan.